Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Apologies for the delay. We actually had a lot more people coming tonight than we even hoped for, so it's wonderful to see. I'm Gwen Robinson, former president of the Foreign Correspondents Club and editor-at-large of Nikkei Asia. And we're here, as you know, tonight to hear the authors of probably one of the best books on Thai history and politics. Before we get to that, just very quickly, I'd just like to remind that on Friday night this week at the club, we'll be doing a live launch of both an exhibition and some speeches connected to paintings by Myanmar refugee children from the border, and we'll have a couple of special people speaking by Zoom at that. All are welcome at the club. You can see our website for details, and very shortly we're going to launch a series of talks by the heads of Thai political parties putting a focus on Thailand. We've also got a few very interesting events coming up on Myanmar. So I won't go into the details because we've started so late, but please keep an eye on our website and Facebook. Turning to the topic tonight, which is a book launch and discussion on A History of Thailand, an evening with Chris Baker and Pasuk Phongpaichit. I'd actually like to just give a quick introduction by quoting one of our panellists, James Wise, former Australian ambassador to Thailand and author, who summed up the impact of the book we're going to discuss extremely eloquently in a recent essay, I have to confess, for Nikkei Asia. He said, for almost 2 decades, Chris Baker and Pasuk Phongpaichit's A History of Thailand has been a compass for anyone trying to navigate Thailand's mystifying politics, equivocal foreign policy, and trapped tiger economy. This new edition confirms that no authors are better credentialed to explain Thailand to general readers and specialists alike. So, just to recap, since its first appearance in 2005, A History of Thailand has been hailed as a lively, readable and authoritative account of how the country over several centuries became what it is today. Interestingly, actually, it's not just English. The Thai version in 2014 became a surprise hit and has been reprinted 13 times. Quite a record, I think, for such a book. Tonight, we're very fortunate to have the authors and 2 outstanding commentators and observers of Thai history and politics to mark the launch. This 4th English edition is almost like launching a new book. It has a new final chapter, which, yes, goes into the turbulence we've seen in very recent years, not only on the political events from 2005 to the youth protests of 2021, but also on less noticed changes in Thai society, economy, and popular culture of recent decades. As Chris has said, this new edition actually has over 200 other major editions apart from that wonderful, what do you call it, postscript and whatever at the end, based on new scholarship, including on the legacy from the Ayutthaya era, reforms of King Chulalongkorn, that's Rama V, and the royalist reaction against the revolution of 1932. It also happens to have one of the most beautiful, striking and unusual covers, and probably quite political, of any history book I've seen. And it features, as you can see on the screen there, a painting of Democracy Monument crafted from seafood. So I can let either Chris or Pasuk explain that. So to introduce our speakers tonight, on my far right is Chris Baker, historian and author, and next to him is James Wise, author of Thailand History, Politics and the Rule of Law, a long-time observer and analyst of the country and a former Australian ambassador to Thailand. Next to him is Prajak Konkirati, Associate Professor of Political Science at Thammasat University and author of the forthcoming book, Thailand, Polarisation, Violence and Democratic Regression, which is going to be published by Cambridge University Press in 2023. And finally, last but very not least, is Pasuk Phongpaichit, Emeritus Professor, Faculty of Economics, Chulalongkorn University. So I think we will kick off with you, Ajahn Pasuk.
Thank you very much, Graham.
No, is the sound okay? I think we should turn off my microphone.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Gwen. Thank you very much for your coming today. I'm going to be very brief because the main author is there. This book first came out in 2005. We were writing it 20 years ago now. We did not expect it to last this long, but it has sold enough for the publisher to keep it going. I want to briefly suggest 2 reasons why this might be so, and also to answer Gwen's question, actually when she wrote to us on the email. First, Thailand is quite difficult for many people to understand. Just think of the events over the last 15, 20 years. Quite amazing. Who expected to see schoolgirls doing their homework in a demo? A book gives a coherent narrative of the changes over the long term, seems to have been useful and appealing for many people. And that narrative has a core theme. Most other countries in Asia went through 2 clear disruptions in the last 2 centuries. The old order or ancien regime was swept away by colonialism. And then colonial rule was swept away by nationalism. But Thailand missed these 2 disruptions and has more continuities with the past, notably the monarchy and bureaucracy. However, if we look at the economy and society, the picture is quite different. Thailand remained very agricultural, rather poor, and rather isolated until very late, until after the Second World War, just think. It then went through a major and very jarring economic transformation under the impact of globalization. And the social impacts have been immense. One way to understand the turmoil in recent years is that the politics lags far behind the changes in the economy and society. A second point about the book is that general history like these tend to concentrate on the elite, and much of society gets left out. We have tried to counter this by giving space to popular culture, which is a voice for the people, the ordinary people outside the elite circles. And we have looked especially at music, from Luk Thung, country music in the 60s, to rap in Klong Tei today, but also at television, mass market cinema, and sports like Thai boxing. Many Sakon international boxing done here. Many readers have commented to us how much they like this aspect of the book. And in this update, we probably should have spent more time on the social media, not for its political impact, but its cultural impact, because the way it gives opportunities for ordinary people to project themselves in public space as commentators, entrepreneurs, cultural entrepreneurs, or otherwise influencers, celebs, people like Pimri Pai, from singer to entrepreneur to philanthropist, quite fascinating. Thank you. So.
Well, okay. Am I on? Okay.
Yes.
You see, they put us at the farther end of the table, so we can't collaborate too much here. we had never expected to write this fourth edition. After the last one, I think we had had enough with this book, and we thought probably the readers had had enough with it too. But I think it was only after the coup of 2014 and then the succession in the monarchy that came after that, and the extraordinary events that were associated with both of those transitions, that we thought probably there was a reason to write another edition. Because when you're living through this day to day, you probably don't get the idea of how all these little changes add up into something quite remarkable. And if you're overseas and not getting much information on Thailand, it's very difficult to fit all this together. But really, the changes that have taken place since basically the millennium, I mean, I think it's just unbelievable. I mean, just quite it blows you away. So we decided we would do it again. We proposed the idea to the publisher. They said, yes, a good idea. So we simply threw away everything which we had written in the previous editions on everything after 2000, and we wrote that bit completely again. And it's sort of like an oh my God chapter as you read through it. But that wasn't the only thing we've changed, because there's an awful lot of good scholarship that has come out on Thailand in the last 10 years, particularly in the Thai language, but not only that, especially on the events after the 1932 revolution. 3 books by this extraordinary Thai scholar, Nattapon Jaijing, who is currently being sued to try and stop him being so effective. Which are really remarkable, but also by the Indian Australian scholar Arjun Subramaniam. Also a lot of interesting stuff on the fifth reign, on the period of the reforms of King Chulalongkorn, especially about law and the judicial system and several other things in that time. So not only that. So we have made, apart from this last chapter, about 200 major changes. And by a change, I don't mean a few words. I mean when you've rewritten a paragraph or a page or a section. So it's really somewhat different from what has gone before. Now, we wanted to have a cover that signaled to the market. This was different, it wasn't. But Cambridge University Press, it's sometimes a bit like dealing with the tax department when you're dealing with it. They're quite difficult in some ways. And one of the things is they think covers, book cover, is their job. And in terms of that, the author is a problem and shouldn't be involved too much. So when the first one came out in 2005, they had this, nice picture of this. And then when we did the update, which was in, 2009, which is the time of the red-yellow battles, they did this and, oh dear, it was yellow. Okay? So at that point we said, look, this is a book about people. It's very much a people thing. Can we please get away from these symbols of authoritarianism on the cover? So they came out without our help with this, which we like very much, of the third edition, which is based upon a mural in a temple in Bangkok. So we came to this edition, and again, they don't sort of ask you about the cover, they present you with the cover, which is finished, And this time they presented, and I said, look, I really don't like this very much. And, we had this very successful one last time with a mural. Could we look at something similar? Could we try and look at a painting and so on? And they said, okay, why don't you try? And we went to some friends of ours, but particularly Kundang Chatwichai, who runs the Bangkok Art and Cultural Centre down the road, who is a very old friend. And he came up with this quite extraordinary painting, right? Absolutely amazing. And we looked at that and we said, yes, absolutely yes. And we went to the publisher CUP, and luckily, they said yes too. And then we went to the author, who is this lovely man I haven't met yet, Tien Chai Nok Ngam, who has a lovely name. It means beautiful bird, which is lovely. And he's a very established painter. And most of his work has a kind of Buddhist theme and a bit of a political theme in there as well. So we asked him then to write a little bit, to explain this painting. So he wrote a very, very nice piece, which I'm going to read now. He said, "One day, while I was working on a painting and watching the news of a demonstration, by chance a thought ran through my mind. Democracy is like food, good food, which people like to eat. With that thought, a scene instantly popped into my head of the Democracy Monument floating in the sea. I sketched out the idea, but somehow I didn't like the four wings of the monument. At that time, our Prime Minister happened to be a woman, Yingluck, whose nickname is Bo, meaning a crab. That made me think of using sea creatures, prawns, shellfish, crab and fish for the wings on the monument. Then I thought, there should be a beach, because it would be too plain without one. And that meant there had to be people walking on the beach and some lying there sunbathing. And if the sunbathers were clothed, it would be not so interesting. More lively if they were naked. So the people walking on the beach are enjoying looking at both the Democracy Monument with its fishy wings and the naked bodies lying on the sand. But they are much more interested in the monument, not really distracted by the naked bodies. And as for the sunbathers, they're not bothering anybody, not infringing on anybody's rights. They're just lying there, absorbing the vitamin D, watching people and seeing the Democracy Monument decked in seafood. Just lovely. In truth, it's a comparison between democracy and food, and especially seafood. Because I live near the sea. He lives in Chonburi. And seafood is so good. Everyone likes eating deep sea fish and deep sea shellfish. In the same way, they want to have a deep, full-blown version of democracy. Isn't that wonderful? We haven't actually met him yet. So isn't it wonderful? And, you know, when we asked him if we could say, he said, and we said, you know, how much do you want to pay? He said, oh, no, just use it, just use it. We actually paid him some money, but that's different. The one other thing I want to say about the book is a little bit about the theming, if you like. You know, if you look at the scholarship that has come out on Thailand, particularly in the last 10 years, about 80% of it is about the monarchy. Yeah? It's quite extraordinary how much of it is about the monarchy. And of course, that's good because, you know, before there wasn't very much, and Paul Handley's book kind of, broke the dam. And it's good to have had so much now in recent years. But, you know, there comes a point where by having so much about the monarchy, it tends to give a picture that this is the only thing that's important about Thai politics, the only thing you have to know about, the rest is unimportant. And the Chulalongkorn historian Ajahn Wasana Wongsurawat wrote a book where she said, basically, nothing else is important. You forget all this stuff about democracy, it's nonsense. It's all about the king and the businessman. And that's the only thing you need to understand Thai politics. So, in a sense, all of the stuff that Pasuk and I have written, both in these history books and in other stuff about political economy and also literature, is very much about building a more popular democratic story about Thailand than one that just focuses on the monarchy. I sometimes think that even when these books highly critical of the monarchy come out, the people in the royalist circle actually like it because it says we're the only thing that's important. You know? And so, in a sense, when writing this book, this version, this was very much in the back of our minds and something that we were always talking about. And I didn't want to lose the thread of the democratic tradition. So this last chapter starts off with a passage which I think is almost the last passage we wrote, and I think is the key for this edition, which says, during the 27 years from the restoration of the Parliament in 1978 to the election of 2005, the parliamentary system became established as never before. Elected politicians reclaimed space from the military, gradually at first, then decisively from 1992. Successive constitutional reforms enlarged the role of elections. Popular participation increased from a 44% turnout in 1979 to 73% in 2005. Policy platforms became a significant factor in elections from 2001, and the party system was streamlined into an approximation of a two-party system. The cabinet and the parliament gradually passed more legislation responsive to popular demands, including social welfare, reform of the bureaucracy, expansion of education, supports for agriculture, provisions to combat poverty. And as the parliamentary regime strengthened, there was more space for media, civil society, and public debate. Around the millennium, and don't forget this because we do so easily, Thailand was vaunted as the most open society in Southeast Asia. Think of it, right? And though many problems remained, the distance from the book burning of the Thanin government in 1976, the really conservative, to the open debates of the early 2000s was immense. And this, of course, this is the prelim to saying, look at what has happened since then, when Thailand is now bottom of every scale, of civil justice, democracy, openness, academic freedom, everything in this region. So it's quite a story. And I hope that's what this edition tells us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Before we turn to our commentators, I forgot to say that we have a consignment of books being sold up there by Asia Books, and I'd recommend that you've got the authors here on site if you're thinking of buying a copy at all, and Asia Books has kindly offered a discount on the cover price of 1,375 baht, so you can buy it tonight here at 1,000 what was it once? Something like an 80 baht discount. So anyway, it's up there by the door, and you can use credit cards as well as cash. So just to after that plug, I'd like to turn to Ajahn Prajak, and perhaps you could both talk about why you think this book is significant, or at least the new edition. Ajahn.
Thank you, Gwen. Very glad to be here because I respect both Ajahn Pasuk and Ajahn Chris very much, and I love this book. So today I want to sell this book. I'm going to be a bookseller. This.
We're not paying him to say that.
Yeah. Just only samosa, very, very cheap. But I love this book, and I assigned it to my class since it first came out, both in Thai version and English version, because I have to teach Thai politics at Thammasat in both international program and Thai program. And students, they are lazy, right? When you have the syllabus and 15 pages and 100 of articles and books, they say, oh, we don't have time for that. Ajahn, just give us one book. You know, we don't have time. We are millennial. Other important things to do. Just one book that will give us a broad picture of, you know, Thai history, Thai political development. We only have time for one book. So I said, okay, this one. You read it, okay? Make sure you finish, you know, one book. And I'm gonna tell you the same thing. If you're so busy, right, as a journalist, you know, businessman, you know, ambassador, you know, if you want to read just one book or pay, you know, the price for just one book and have an overview of the Thai history, this is the one. I think I'm not exaggerating this because we lack a good book or textbook on the history of Thailand, okay? Especially for the current period, which is very volatile, you know, and very dynamic. So this is the one because, and I would say writing an overview book of this kind is very difficult because I'm writing one and I'm having difficulty. But you know, my book focuses on only political history, political development since the 1950s. I spent a lot of time writing this. Since Prayut is still have, you know, immense power, right? By the time I start writing the book, now I have to finish my book very soon because I don't know what's gonna happen to him, right? Because I claim about the Prayut regime so strong, changed Thai society so much, you know, economically, politically, you know, culturally. If next week the Constitutional Court said, okay, Prayut, you have to go. So my book gonna be out of date, right? And I'm gonna talk about this point later about this dynamic, fluid, ever-changing nature of Thai political society. But Ajahn Pasuk and Ajahn Chris did a very wonderful job and almost impossible for other scholars to do because in this book they didn't only, you know, talk about political history. By reading this book, you get, you know, economic history, you know, social history and cultural history. So it's a book for lazy readers, right? You don't need to read all other things. You can start from this book. They synthesize everything for you. And in the past few years, as Ajahn Chris mentioned, actually there are several good scholarship on Thailand, both in English and in Thai, especially the modern era after 1932 revolution. Ajahn Pasuk and Ajahn Chris did a very good job in the latest edition to read them all and synthesize them and also have their own analysis and have their own take on those, you know, scholarship. So I think this is the one that the textbook that, you know, I myself want to write because it's not boring. Normally it's like a sleeping pill, right? History textbook. That's why I love this cover very much. And I don't like the first two versions of the first edition and the second edition, you know. I have to be careful because I'm going to publish a book with Cambridge University Press soon. So please choose something nice for me. But why I don't like the first edition and the second edition cover? Because it looks like, if Ajahn Chris can show you again, you know, it scared my student off, you know. They said, oh, you know, it's like a textbook that can be published by the Thai government, you know, this kind of cover, History of Thailand, official version, you know. and then you have chronology by the king, or the government, and so boring. But it doesn't capture the content within the book, which is very playful, colorful, dynamic, and very well-rounded. Okay, so the fourth edition, I think, came close to what the book is really about. Very very stylish, very it represents Thailand actually. The first and the second edition doesn't represent the Thai society as it is. Okay, so I want to make a few points for the sake of the discussion. After I already sold the books, right? Hopefully everyone buy the books later. And I'm gonna invite all of you again next year when my book come out. Okay.
We'll hold you to that.
Okay, thank you. So the first point I want to make is similar to Ajahn Chris mentioned about the background of the book. If you look at the year that this book came out, 2005, right? That's the start of the current political crisis, the so-called color-coded crisis, right? Yellow shirt, red shirt, and the crisis dragged on actually until today. Is a very long political turmoil that we had, right, for almost 2 decades already. During this political turmoil time, one of the things that I think very striking is people look back into history, and history itself is become the subject of debate. It's very politicized. It fiercely debated by all sides, and especially the young generation. They want to know more about the historical development of their own society. So they question a lot. They ask a lot of questions. They dig deep. Okay, just give you one anecdote. The 24th of June this year, which is normally the anniversary of the 1932 revolution, right? 24th of June. It's not in the official history. It's not a national holiday, okay, which is quite weird, right? And my generation, we don't know anything about this revolution. We don't know about the People Party, who is the leader of this revolution. But the current generation, they know, and they're eager to know more. So I was invited by one high school this year, and I'm very surprised. They said, I got an email from the high school teacher, said, can you come to our school and give a lecture on 1932 revolution to our students? I said, why you invited me? Okay, because I'm very critical, right, to the official history, to the government. So I'm surprised that this high school asked me. They said, it's a request from the student themselves. They said they're not happy with the school textbook and curriculum. And they want to know more. And so they asked me to give a lecture, give a talk on this 1932 revolution. And not only this high school, as Ajahn Pasuk mentioned, the youth movement in the past 2 or 3 years, they question the official history. They question everything that they have been taught since they were young, right? And so history become the subject of debate. So that's why Ajahn Chris and Pasuk books become a bestseller. Another book that Ajahn Chris mentioned by Dr. Nathapong Chaijing, unfortunately it's not in English yet, it's in Thai. It's about Thai politics during the Cold War period. And he talks about the 3 pillars, the American roles during the Cold War, the monarchy, and the military that shaped Thailand, right? I think up until now, they print more than 100,000 copies. can you believe it? Within less than 2 years, right? Normally it not happened before. In the past, if you write this kind of academic books, you sell 1,000 copies, you thank God already. Oh my God, okay, I can have samosa now. But this day, Ajahn Chris and Pasuk book in English edition, 4th edition, in Thai, 14 printing already, right? So actually, it reflects the current time in Thai society that we live in. That history itself history matters. But when you read this book, I read it again during the weekend. It's amazing that actually history matters long time ago. Actually, history is a subject of debate since the beginning of the formation of the nation state. And it's the elite themselves who are aware the importance of history. There's a quote in this book by Rama V, King Chulalongkorn. By the time that he building the state, modern state, right, he aware that another thing that he need to do is writing a new history, giving a new narrative to the political machine, to the new political arrangement that he built. Because the nation state alone as a political machine cannot endure or survive without the narrative that gonna underpin it or legitimize the rulers, right, claim to power. So that's when Rama V, Rama VI, and other royalist intellectuals who are most of them are half brothers of King Chulalongkorn, write a new history, a Thai national history that since then have been taught for generation, right, up until to my generation. So history is very powerful, writing history itself. But this national narrative, official narrative, have been challenged from time to time, right? It's not completely dominant. And it's wonderful if you read through this book to see this, contestation of the history. But Ajahn Chris and Pasuk books, they, this book is not polemical, it's not politicized. The good thing about it is in the midst of this politicized debate about history, this textbook offers you quite a well-balanced, well-rounded, and quite academic views of what's happening in Thailand. Okay, so that's my first point. Why this book matters? Why this book become the bestseller? Because I think it comes with time, and people want to know more about history. If you can read Thai, you go through many websites. Now they have a list for readers, especially young generation. 100 books you need to read before you die on Thai history. Because now people are not lazy, they want to know more. So one book is not enough. They read one book and they want to know more. They check footnotes, reference, and they go to find other books, in particular topic. So now the online website, they give people 50 books you have to read, 100 books you have to read on Thai history. This is amazing. It never happened before. Normally, history is a boring subject, right, that everyone avoids. Another point I want to make is, normally when we thought about Thailand or Thai politics in particular, we think we have a picture of static society, right? Especially the current era, perhaps because Prime Minister Prayut stayed too long, right? 8 years. So when we thought about Thai society, bureaucracy, military, monarchy dominate everything. Thai society stuck, right? But actually, if you read this book and you have a broad overview of not only 8 years or the current crisis, but have an overview of 400 years, 500 years, actually, Thai society change all the time. It's so dynamic. It's never been static. 8 years is very short if you look in a broad term, in a broad trajectory. For example, we have so many critical junctures. Right? By late 18th century, early 19th century, we have a modern nation state built by the king, right? Rama V, Rama VI. This absolute regime that's so powerful lasts for only about 4 decades. Then you have the revolution in 1932 by the People Party, right? Destroy this absolute monarchy regime. The People Party's regime who tried to build a new constitutional democracy in Thailand lasts for only about 15 years. Then you have military coup, right? Now, build a very strong military regime in Thailand. Looks similar to what happened in other parts of the world at that time, in South Korea, in Indonesia, in Brazil, Chile, Argentina, right? The junta regime of the Cold War. But then by 1970s, this military regime collapsed. You have a radicalized leftist, communist student labor union, right? Try to change Thailand in a radical way. And then you have a civil war between the communist movement and the Thai state. But by mid-1980s, communist movement collapsed, defeated by the Thai state. Right? And then you have an era of parliamentary democracy, businessmen, these political families, business families came into parliament. People think this is gonna last long, right? No more coup d'etat. And then you have another coup in 1991. People said, oh, wow, what happened to Thailand, right? The Cold War just ended, but we had military coup, right, in 1991. But then that coup lasts long for only 1 year. We have a democratic uprising by the middle class, the so-called mobile phone mob. But 5 years later, we have financial crisis. People said, oh, we doomed now. We're gonna be like Argentina, we're gonna be like other countries, that cannot survive this financial crisis. And then you have Thaksin, which Ajahn Chris and Ajahn Pasuk wrote about, right? And people said, oh, we're gonna have Hugo Chavez, populist, leaders, and Thaksin gonna rule forever, right? And Thaksin himself believed he's gonna rule for 20 years at least. And then you have now 2 military coups, and now a roller coaster of Thai politics. But if you read this book, it is normal, right? If you look back in history, we have so many critical junctures, and Thailand changed all the time. It's never been static. Because there are so many social forces emerge from time to time. And then with these social forces, you have new ideologies and contested of ideologies. And then, new political arrangement that try to adjust to the change. As Ajahn Pasuk mentioned in her introduction, I think the problem of the current period is that the Thai elite try to hold back everything. Despite the rapid socio-economic change and the ideologies, right, that coming, they try to hold back. And so politics lag behind the socio-economic change, generation change, cultural change. The last point that I want to make is about the nation and the nation state. Ajahn Chris mentioned in the introduction that these days normally when people write history, they avoid to use a nation or nation state as a focal point, right? They talk about other things, right? History of gender, of social class, right? Of identity, of minority groups. But I think in Thailand it's still useful, nation and nation state as a lens to understand history. And especially the contestation over the meaning of the nation itself. I think this is like the recurring theme of this book, in my opinion, that the nation has been divided and redefined by all groups all the time. And this drives the dynamics of the Thai society. And now we come to the point that the dominant narrative about the nation, which is the king as embodiment of the nation, which is coined since King Chulalongkorn. This notion of royal nationalism, or nation and the king is the same thing, has been questioned and challenged. But Thai society have not come to terms with what is the new definition of the nation that can be embraced by all sides, that can move Thai society forward during the rapid changing time and also the change of the reign. Because I think the notion of the king as an embodiment of the nation has been strongly redefined by King Rama IX, the late King Phongpaichit. And I think now it is a new era that perhaps need another book, okay, or another edition. They already add the last chapter, right? So if you have the first 3 editions, is out of date now. You cannot rely on that because the new chapter cover a lot since 2006. Many things happen, but I think they're very smart. They build a solid, foundation in the first chapters about this nation building, state building, cultural change. So every time we have a new crisis, they can just add a new chapter, right? And I think perhaps by next year, you might need to write a new chapter to add into the 5th edition. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Ajahn. I can just repeat that he is not on commission. He's not getting any commission for this tonight, just samosas and a drink, perhaps. Thank you very much for that. And I'd like to turn finally to our second commentator, James Wise. But just before you start, James, I just want to say we will have time for questions after that. So either from the floor, well, actually, I think from the floor. So we'll turn to that after you, James. Why do you think this book is significant?
Well, for the same reasons that Ajahn has commented, I can only endorse what he had to say, but also what Pasuk also said is this: if you're writing a book about the formation of the nation state in Thailand, it has to be a book which has a lot about kings, about generals and about tycoons in it. And clearly this book has covers those very admirably. But what it adds is a socio-cultural element, if you like, to the story of Thailand. And that as diverse as sort of public architecture, music, graffiti, everything is in there, and just gives it a depth and colour and movement, which is what is often lacking from general history books. Another reason why this book is so important is that since it was last written, a lot has happened. Even though the most recent edition was only in 2014, I can think you had the coup, you had how many years of 5 years, I think, of direct military rule, you had the death of the previous monarch, a new constitution drafted, a referendum, followed by an election, you had a political party, a popular political party banned, and you had the incredible protests of 1921. So there's a lot that has happened just in that short period. And the questions that are being asked, especially about the protesters, of course, the questions that are being asked are much sharper about the political role of the monarchy, the military, and the judiciary. But also the response of the state, of the government, has been sharper in another sense, to my mind, and that is, I'm not sure whether you shared the feeling I had when you saw the demonstrations. I was in Australia at the time, so I was only seeing it electronically because of COVID, but if you had any knowledge at all of what happened in 1973, 1976, 1992, 2010, you sort of lived in fear that the government would mow them down, as it has done in the past, but it didn't. There were certainly, the security forces did tackle certain demonstrators and were quite rigorous in their approach to them, but not as happened on those other occasions. They use lèse-majesté and other similar laws to intimidate. So the state also responded differently this time. And obviously in one sense it's good we didn't have the bloodshed that we had in the 70s, 90s, 2010. But it's also a sign of how much cleverer the state is becoming at authoritarianism. And that's there. So this is why the book's important, because it touches on those things as well. And of course, that authoritarianism of the state is now being conducted under a veneer of parliamentary democracy, which again sort of it's a different environment that we find ourselves in. This has been mentioned before, but I'll just say it again. A real sort of virtue of this book is that Chris and Pasuk have, of course, kept very up to date with all the latest research, and the main findings of that are captured in this book. And for those of us who don't read Thai, it's wonderful to have the best Thai scholarship synthesised and brought to us in this book. But of course, the value of the book is not just in what it tells us about the research of others. The value of the book also is in that we get an updated version of the views of two of the best commentators and analysts of modern Thailand, or not only modern Thailand, here in Chris and Pasuk. And where this came out in particular is in that last chapter, and I'm not sure if Chris wants to, or Pasuk wanted to speak a little bit more about this, but this idea of generational change and of these three generations that are currently reflected in Thai politics. So that, the 60s and above are running the show, basically. You have a generation of people in their from their from their 30s up until their early 40s, who are perhaps comparable with baby boomers in countries like Australia, where they've been largely optimistic in their outlook and had a strong sense of entitlement as well. And then you have these young people, the people below 25, who have been brought up during a period of mass politics. And as Chris and Pasuk mentioned, they're what they call digital natives. That their way of interacting with the world is just so different. They're unaware of the old verities, if you like, of Thai history and politics. Or if they are aware of them, they're unimpressed by them. And in a sense, what they want is very simple. They just want a fairer, more just society and politics which is more representative. Which brings me to, again, another point of the book, I think, is the continuities. Because that quest for a fairer, more just society, for more representative politics, was indeed what stimulated the 1932 events. The People's Party, that was at the core of the People's Party. And the other, I think, interesting comparison is education. Because at the heart of, in so many ways, of what the People's Party sought and what they actually, in so many ways, delivered, was to broaden education. It was really to lift the quantity of education, if you like, because the society was largely illiterate. And that one of the great contributions of the revolution was, in fact, the education reforms which were introduced. And again, these young demonstrators, education, you had the bad students amongst the demonstrators and what they were on about, focusing now on the quality of education. So again, that's just a continuity, but these continuities are what come out in the book as well. The other thing is, and this will naturally get greater focus over the next decade as we get close to the centenary of 1932, but it again prompted more questions about what does 1932 mean? What happened? And unfortunately, I haven't yet been able to get my hands on a copy of Arjun Subramaniam's book, which is clearly a very good book, but I have watched a more than an hour-long sort of presentation he made on his book. And again, what struck me there is what he's saying about the paternalism, if you like, I think he calls it the democratic paternalism of the People's Party over the period from the early 30s through to the mid-40s. And that paternalism persists. And you see it even in someone like Prayut with his 12 virtues, with, again, this trying to present himself as as some sort of father figure. Not very convincingly, it seems, to most Thais, but again, that impulse is there, that instinct is there. The paternalism, which is clearly very much a feature of Thai society and politics as well. Let me just see if there's anything else at this stage. Not really. I mean, I should have said this too. The other thing, others have made this point too. This book is just so readable. It's done with academic sort of rigour. It's a very scholarly book, but it is also very accessible. And this is, again, one of the reasons why I think it has been so successful and why it will continue to be so successful, and why your recommendation to your students, if they're going to read one book, read this one, I think is a good one. With the Thai translation, I'd be interested to hear a little bit more from Chris on, any reason why it was the edition in 2014 and not early editions which you decided to translate, or had you always intended to translate it? And is there any noticeable difference between the way that non-Thai readers have responded to the book and the way that Thai readers have, because it would tell us, I think, as non-Thais, quite a lot about how Thais are relating to their history through their response to your book. But let me just finish there.
Well, thanks, James. You just thanks very much for those great comments. And you actually hijacked one of my questions, but I think they are both excellent questions. Maybe, Pasuk, you might have some thoughts as well, or Chris, response of Thais and, foreigners. I suppose the only other language is English, right? No other languages. To the book, and James's other point. And then we'll take questions from the floor. Before you do that, can I just ask one very simple question, which is, for me, I've been meaning to ask you. Last year, I think you guys had several books on the boil at once. Didn't you publish about 3 in a year? 2. Anyway, and then another. Yes. But what's your project now? Can you talk about it?
Let me talk about the other one first. And first, thank you so much to James and to Ajahn Prajak. We will see you out at the back door later with. The story of the Thai edition is simply that it took us a long time to get it translated, because we have had some of our stuff translated into Thai by other people, and it didn't work. You spent more time correcting it. So in this case, Pasuk translated it, and she's quite a busy lady, so it took a long time, and we didn't get it finished then until the 3rd edition. And when it was published by Matichon, which is the big newspaper group and the biggest serious book publisher here, and when they were doing it, they hired this very famous artist to do a cover and so on. And so we thought, why? And they got very good editors to work on it. And we were thinking, why? And we turned up for a launch event, which was in the annual book fair in the Queen Sirikit Centre. And you go in there, and there's this huge Matichon booth, and they put up in sort of along the top, they put up their top 10 books selling at the fair. And we arrived on about the 3rd or 4th day, because we've been in Japan. We got there, and there it is. It's their best-selling book. And you could have knocked us over with a feather, because, we say it's a history book. History's boring. Thais don't read. They don't read history. And there it was, We then went into a launch event, and the main speech was given by Ajahn Piyabut, who has become slightly more famous since he was doing this. He was the number 2 in the Future Forward Party. He gave a brilliant presentation to a packed room, and we sat there and signed copies for about 2 hours. And everyone coming down the line was under the age of 20. Yeah? And of course, what Matichon had twigged, because they're closer to the ground and it's their job, that this sentiment that boiled over in 2020 had been coming beforehand. That these kids who had got their hands on the mobile phone, who had the world in their hands and had realized, there was a much more to know, seized on this book. Now, we had written it for the international audience. When we wrote it, we didn't think about the Thai audience. when we translated it, we decided, for reasons of laziness as much as anything else, to not change a thing. We didn't leave anything out because we thought you didn't have to have it in for the time. We didn't change anything because we thought it was too sensitive. You know, little bits, but nothing serious. So it was an international time. And of course, what it has, therefore, is tons of stuff which is not in the books they're reading at school. You know, tons of stuff, because the official version of Thai history is very, very much edited and policed. You know, so it just, and of course, after going through our book, they very then quickly went on to the heavier stuff, to read Jan Prajak's book, for instance, and many other heavier things. They went through us pretty quickly to much more, the source books that we have read. But somehow it just, had this role in the middle, which I think was quite interesting. But I just want to say one other thing about this point about putting in the popular culture and all this stuff. There was a lovely moment we had a couple of years ago when there is a very lovely lady who had come back from studying overseas, but was really very Thai in her attitude, and we gave her a copy of the book to read. And she opened the index, and the first thing she saw was Joey Boy in the index. Now, Joey Boy is a singer who became a kind of media personality of the sort of Thailand's Got Talent. He's a bit of a Simon Cowell type figure like that. And she was saying, this is a history book. Why do you have Joey Boy? Why do you get Joey Boy? Because, of course, history is about kings and big people. It's not about people like Joey Boy. But he was immensely important as a figure in all kinds of ways, not only for why we used it in our book. So I think one of the other reasons is that it became popular is people who read it, who had this very narrow version of what history should be, one king after another, a couple of generals and a tycoon, and that's done. And suddenly here we had sportsmen, we had boxers, we had, I think it was what eventually people told us, and I think this is very nice too. When we read this old history, which is about kings and generals, we can't see ourselves. We can't find ourselves, our families, our traditions, anything. We read your kind of history, when you talk about how the Chinese come to Thailand, you talk about how this peasant society was created and then it broke down. We find our own history in there. So I think that's another reason why it was so successful.
Thank you, Chris. Oh, and the next project. You can talk in vague terms. I think James had suggested yet another edition or a completely new history, or was that Ajahn Prajak?
I have gone.
Start again.
For the last few years, I have sort of gone right back into the early history. Spent most of my time looking at the 15th century and so on, so forth like that, and have written a bit about that. While Pasuk has done a big project about land in recent years, and what you call land governance, which is fundamentally how land is owned and administered here, and particularly the big problems that have arisen over the forests. And the central question of this is that during the Cold War, ending in the 1980s, Thailand destroyed half of its forests at that period, partly through agricultural expansion, partly through destroying the forests to deny them to the communists. And at the end of that period, they declared most of what was left as national parks and other things, and passed a law was already passed saying that no people should live there. By that time, there were some 10 to 12 million people living in those areas they had just defined as forests without going to look who was there. Okay? So you created this immense problem where you have, maybe a fifth or a sixth of your population declared to be illegal squatters. And 30 years later, you haven't solved that problem a bit. And it's a source of, immense pain to an awful lot of people. So that's one project. And the other one is about old literature. There are basically 6 pieces of old Thai literature going back to around 1500, going back to 500 years ago. We have translated and published 3 of them already. We're doing 2 more, so that's the other one.
Wow. Lots of events at the FCCT coming up. Anyway, I can see we've got some people who want to ask questions. Peter? I think is the microphone on?
Oh, yeah, it's on. Okay, good. Yeah, Peter Jansen, freelance journalist. Chris and Ajahn Pasuk, thank you for updating this history. I bought your first one, or the second or third one, and now I bought the fourth. One of the things that's happened since you wrote the last edition was Ayutthaya. You guys did a really great history of Ayutthaya, which I enjoyed. And I just wonder how that researching the history of Ayutthaya affected your insights into modern Thai history, specifically on the monarchy. I remember listening to Kun Anand Panriyachun. Maybe he was talking here, and he's saying, look, the monarchy has been around for 800 years in Thailand. It's not a new thing, yeah? It's been around for a long time, yeah? And the fact that people are writing about it so much is maybe something new, but I mean, the monarchy has been here a long time. I remember doing an article for Fortune magazine. They were talking about, hey, what's Thailand going to be like in 20 years from now? And every hotshot I talked to, including Anand Parachun, said, well, maybe the thing specific or unique about Thailand is we'll still have the monarchy, yeah? And so I guess my question is, number one, how did Ayutthaya affect your outlook or your insights into modern Thailand? And number two, hasn't the monarchy been around a long time? Is there, is there anything you can say about the fact that it's been here 800 years? Maybe Thailand is kind of unique in having this institution. I guess that's my question. Yeah?
Let me answer the second point first. After 1932, before that, you had the absolute monarchy. They controlled everything. I mean, literally, it was a really absolute monarchy. And it gets pushed aside, and you have a constitution and a constitutional regime and new ideologies. And the remaining royalists began to think how to restore the power of the monarchy in a totally different political setup to what they had before. And we're talking about the fact, is that they used to have 25% of the national budget they could use as they like, but it's been taken away. There are real practical problems about this. But the ideological problem is, how do we rebase our power after we have lost absolutism? Okay? And there was lots of answers to this, and eventually the most successful one was the one of Rama V, which says, I am the moral king. So I am a source of very different authority, which has, I have, moral right on my side, which is a bit like, so, and he doesn't need, it's totally outside democracy, constitutions, or anything else, and therefore can challenge constitutions and democracies and anything else. But before the royalists got to that answer, they tried many other different theories as well, and just ideas. And one of the things they came up with was exactly what Peter has just said. Oh, we've had monarchs here for 800 years, and haven't they all been good? So you set about writing a history in which you have a continuity of monarchs, at least back to the 14th century, as if it's unbroken, almost Japanese, not quite going back to the sun, but more or less in the same way, unbroken, and they were all good. And it's significant that Peter has just repeated that theory right now. Right? Okay? Because it was immensely powerful and popular. And this was certainly before Rama IX made the moral king more successful. This was a very important part of saying why monarchy is so important and why we need to have it back again here, as it were. Now, if you read our book on Ayutthaya, you will find, I mean, we don't sort of espouse this theory, and in fact, it hasn't been particularly successful, nowhere near as successful as this book in Thai, and partly because I think it's much more difficult for Thai readers to take, because it kind of challenges that view. Doesn't give a huge, it gives space to the monarchy, but it puts it in a very different context. And it particularly shows that there is no continuity, right? Each of these dynasties lasts, 4 or 5 kings and then disappears. That there is a huge break in the 16th century when this earlier dynasty, which probably rose in in the middle of the 14th century, is kicked out by people who come down from Pitsanulo. If you read the Thai history, standard Thai, they don't get that, but it clearly is that happens. And if you look particularly in the latter period, the last 100 years, there is immense conflict going on within the society, which is particularly, there are lots of revolts because people are very unhappy for various reasons, but there's also a big distress amongst the elite of that time, the noble elite of that time, because of the monarchy. I won't describe it now, it would take too long. So I think the answer to the first part of Peter's question is that looking at Ayutthaya, in a sense, was a way of exploding that theory and showing how much this theory of the continuous and always good monarchy has been constructed, actually mostly after the Second World War, as a way of finding a new base, ideological base for monarchy in Thailand.
Thanks for a great explanation, Chris. So I think we will shortly, there is one more question, yes, and then I have one, but I'll see if it goes on too long. Please. Can you start again and speak into, can we have volume on that mic, please?
Sure. No, sorry, I can just vote that. Thank you for the amazing presentation. I have a very quick question. First, I have to confess, I haven't read your book.
Introduce yourself first.
Sorry, my name is Wei Shin. I work for an international organization here. And I have to confess, I haven't read your book yet, so forgive my ignorance, if I may. But I would like to ask something about, apart from all the dynamics within Thai society, what are the external factors that actually influence the trajectory of how history evolved here? Like when the panel is talking about what happened in the 1970s, I just can't help thinking, like when you look at Laos and Cambodia in the 1970s, the socialist, the communist movement sweeping away across the country, and the Thai royalists must have seen how the Lao royal family and the Cambodia royal family were decomposed. Then it kind of maybe that kind of influenced them to take some rather extreme reaction when it comes to what happened in Thammasat in 1976, October. And I was also wondering, when geopolitics becomes increasingly interesting today in this region, do you think when the great power comes into play in Southeast Asia, Thai history will face new, might be changed, the trajectory might be changed in the future? Thank you.
Well, I think. Would you like to kick that up? All panelists are welcome to tackle that. So, Chris, why don't you tackle that and
okay.
maybe Ajahn.
I mean, it's a society that's always been very open to outside influences, going way, way back, and that's because, you know, its economy, and here I'm talking about going way back into the Ayutthaya era too, has always been a trading economy, depending very much upon its relations with the outside world. And those have been particularly with China, but also, second to that, with neighboring countries in the region, and then with India and Persia and the Middle East around that. So it's always been responding to, you know, changes in the environment around it, particularly those that affected down the trade routes. And that remains true until today. I don't think it's very different.
Right. Thank you. Would any of you have anything to add to that, or no?
Just
very quickly.
Very quickly. What I like about this book is it locates Thailand in the international context, and also talk about the influence from the outsiders, other great powers from time to time. I think, especially for Thai younger generation, so they don't have a narrow view or just looking inward. I think this is very important. And before we talk about the influence of China today, just looking back, you know, during Ayutthaya period, very cosmopolitan, you know, during the European colonial era, wartime, you know, Japanese influence, and then Cold War American era, it's always, you know, fluctuated and then, you know, change all the time about the roles of the outside or superpower on, you know, the shape of Thai politics and society.
Thank you. That's a very good point. Actually, I want to, before turning to Imtiaz, who might have the last question, I did want to ask a question which also highlights one of my favourite parts of your new edition is the last part, because it also has, I suppose it appeals to a journalist as well. It's almost a mix of a bit of reportage with your, you know, accounts of Penguin and his thoughts, and also you give a really vivid feeling of what happened in the last years, well, as you call it, the emergence of youth really as a political force. And you note how age became a factor in Thai politics, you know, led by people like Thanathorn as never before. The rise of the internet and social media impact on creating all these digital natives, and, you know, really this emergence of youth activism also as we never saw before. So you kind of end with that observation that the succession introduced new types of instability, and how the government depended more and more on its tools of repression, surveillance, punishment, and how those were the conditions that created a social force for which really weren't there before, and that was to propel forward the youth. So if that was so seminal and important, I mean, everyone's lamenting now how steam has gone out of the movement. They've been picked off, locked up, you know, broken-spirited, perhaps. I'd like to ask each one of you really quickly to say, do you think it can come back? And in what way, if so? Pasuk, please start. Do you think youth could go very quickly?
No one knows, right?
That's a good answer.
Especially political scientists, we always fail, right, in predicting what's going to happen. But I think the history of Thailand is a history of discontinuity. And this book shows us. And as I tell you, there are so many critical junctures that when that happened, it changed, the path of the country into different direction. And that's why it's difficult to predict and difficult to understand the Thai society, because every 10 years, I would say, you have a crisis in one form or another, social and political crisis. And there's no one dominant force. If you look back, even the monarchy, the royal power change all the time. I think what's fascinating about Thai monarchy is not about continuity of their power and status, but how they reinvented itself from time to time and adapt to the new environment.
Right.
I
Thank
think
you.
that's the only a few, or perhaps I could not think of any good comparison, that the absolute monarchy regime that already collapsed through the revolution and reinvented itself and revived so much power into the institution.
Okay, thank you.
Despite many challenges. So by saying that, I don't think you cannot rule out any possibility of radical change in the near future if you're looking back in the history.
Okay, it could go any way. Well, so the question really is it cyclical? I mean, is the whole rise of youth as a political power? James, you're looking very...
Is it on?
Yes.
Yeah. If the best way for me to answer this, I think, is just to quickly read a couple of sentences from the review that I did for Nikkei, having mentioned that the protests have abated, then went on to say, but the issues that motivated the protesters remain too hot for the state to touch and too burning for the youth to disown. Missing now is only a spark to reignite another public struggle between older Thais evoking an idealised past and younger Thais wanting to write a different history and to live their own future. So it's just a matter of when, to my way of thinking, rather than if.
Okay, that's good. And Pasuk?
Well, I think we are in a very difficult situation because as we try to show in this book, that the people in the position of power, both in economic and political power, come from a cluster of generation that is a generation that has prospered and grown in a period where all beliefs and all culture was somehow important, and this generation of the baby boomer, right, are very powerful. So, it's like you need a transition in terms of you need a transformation and transition in terms of generation as well. And that generation, it just doesn't mean only economic, but ideological. And there is a huge gap, you see, even in our education now, people of the generations of the baby boomer who became teachers, and then we went through the the successful birth control program, where now we have a huge gap, between the generation, a huge gap. And that happened everywhere. In university now you have, like in my generation, we are trained with a certain approach and certain perspective. Then the next generation of the educators were trained in another sets of values and methodology and so on, just because there's so much change in education around the world. And so there's a big gap there. And in the political and sociological arena, there's also this huge gap. And the generation that are protesting, they are very young. And they don't have the experience or they don't have the power, right? So this is where the difficulty we are in. That's why there is this talk about a possibility of a violence transition. And the older generation also became crystallized in their view of how Thai society should be in terms of value, even little behavior. They can't stand these kids who can speak out, for example. I mean, it's like when I was at the university and in Australia, I can speak up. I can speak up in Australia. When I came back to Thailand, I was an adult already, but people still look at me and say, oh, she can speak, she can have her own thoughts, even though she looks so cute. This is, there's an ideological behind all this. It's not only a view or generation. And that's why it's become very difficult to see smooth transition. But we hope we could manage a smooth transition, because no one lives forever.
Well, thanks for that fantastic insight, actually. Yes.
But don't quote me.
Don't quote you. I'm very sorry to tell you that. Anyway, I
don't live. I won't live that long anyway.
I think many people would agree with you, particularly baby boomers in this room. Chris, do you want to have the last word on that?
Just very quickly. I think, as James said, the repression this time was very clever. They didn't make the mistake of careless violence, and it also was highly technological. They had all kinds of surveillance, and they had water cannons, and everything else. And I'm sorry, where else in the world have you seen blocking demonstrations by building walls of containers? Quite fantastic. Overnight, you have helicopters flying over Bangkok with maybe 100 containers to build a wall to block a
You mean shipping containers?
Oh, yeah, shipping containers. I mean, it's just fantastic. So there was an enormous effort went into that repression. And why? Because of that. Because this was so scary to people like Prayut. You can dress these girls up in sweet little uniforms so they look so nice, but they come out and demonstrate against you. And they don't only say Prayut out, they say end of paternalism. And this was so shocking.
Yeah.
Yeah. So is it over? No way.
Right. I think that's a very good answer. I think that the point, though, of that photograph is they're also willing to do and want to do their homework while they're demonstrating, which I didn't see in Hong Kong, actually. This is really unique. I've never seen a photo like this in protests in any other country, is kids doing their homework in barricades. Anyway, we'll wrap it up now. I guess Imtiaz, a very quick question, if you could.
Yeah. Thank you, Gwen. My question, Imtiaz Muqbil, I cover the travel and tourism industry. My question is directed to all the panelists in view of the extensive work you have done on history, on chronicling history, particularly to Achan Pasuk. One of the motivation factors for historians to chronicle a lot of the events over the last many years, decades, is we somewhat idealistically and perhaps naively like to believe that people will actually learn the lessons of history. In all the chronicling that you'll have done so far, have you come up with any kind of evidence that people in Thailand or Asia or anywhere in the world actually learn the lessons of history?
Well, I think that's for the authors.
I think I would say just quite simply, you'll find it very difficult to find a historian who thinks that people learn lessons from history.
Yeah. Do any of you have anything to add to that? Having written books, all of you?
No, just that, as Chris was saying, and I said a little earlier too, the state here has learned from history. And that is, as I mentioned before, good in as much as we didn't have the bloodshed that some of us feared we might have, but it does mean it's a much better organised and more authoritarian state than we had before too.
Thank you. Anyone else? Well, I think unless there's anything else, I'd like to give our speakers a big hand. I think it was really a great discussion. And to thank our crew over there who handled the live stream as well, Kunpu, Nook and Nick. Thank you. And as I said at the beginning, please look at the website and Facebook for other events. Our politics series will launch fairly soon, and that will be interesting. We'll have some very good speakers for that. And thank you all. The video will be on our Facebook page of this event. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.